In this lesson, we will talk about three main features of our camera that form and adjust the exposure in our interior renders. We will talk about ISO, shutter speed, and aperture, also known as the triangle of exposure. They all three work at the same time, and you can see here on these two images some kind of representation of their activity. And next we will get to Vray, and we will see how we can apply all these three features in practice for our interior render. So basically in this lesson we will talk about this third panel of our Vray physical camera. And you can see here these three features. They are the most used features to control the exposure in our renders. We will get to them in a second. You can see here a bit lower another panel where we can control and switch between different types of exposure. First, we got the physical exposure where we can control the brightness of our image using these three features. And the second method, the exposure value. First of all, when it's active, the ISO goes gray. And in this case, we control the brightness using this value number and the two features, the F-number or aperture and the shutter speed. So let's try to talk about the first feature of our camera, about the shutter speed. This is about how much time the shutter is open and how much light goes on our camera sensor. You can see on this image the shutter speed represented in red color. So typically the shutter speeds are measured in fractions of a second. Slow shutter speeds allow more light to come on camera sensor, and they are used for low light scenes. By the way, this also affects the blurriness in motion, but we will talk about static photos. Slow shutter speeds allow to freeze motion, but also a lower amount of light goes on our camera sensor. Let's switch to max and we will see how that impacts in Vray our interior render. First of all, let's switch to physical exposure, and next I will try to change that parameter and we will see how that impacts our render. In this case, to adjust this render, I've changed only the ISO from 100 to 800, and the shutter speed and F-number or aperture remained at their default value. The default number for our shutter speed is 200, and I'll try to change that, and let's see what happens in our render. When we talk about real photography, of course, we will use some standards. In this case, I will use just a random number. I'll go from 200, for example, to 100. And you can instantly see that the brightness of our render goes up. In this case, we increased the time while our shutter was opened, and the sensor of our camera received more light, resulting in a brighter image. Let's try to increase the time a bit more, and let's see what happens to our render. Keep in mind, if we do have motion in our scene, increasing the shutter speed time also increases the blurriness of our image. So getting back one more time to this image, you can see that the shutter speed controls the amount of light being received by the camera sensor. And while we increase the time, of course in photography we will use the standards that you see here, our image becomes more and more brighter. Well, these are basically the main features that we need to know for our shutter speed. We will also talk about depth of field. This will be a bit later. This also implies the shutter speed. For now, let's reset the value of our shutter speed to default, and let's get to the next feature. The next camera feature is aperture, or we call it F-number. You can see even on this image, this is about the lens of our camera. The aperture is about the hole within our lens that allows a specific amount of light to pass to our camera sensor. You can see even on this image the main settings or the main standards that are used to set the F-number for our camera. And if in the first case the shutter controlled the time while the light was exposed to the sensor, in this second case, the aperture is about the amount of light that passes through our lenses. Of course, the wider we open our lenses, more light will be allowed to pass through those lenses. Aperture also controls the depth of field. We will talk about that a bit later. This is about a portion of the scene that appears to be sharp or in focus. If the aperture is small, then the depth of field will be large. And vice versa, if the aperture is large, then the depth of field will be small. Okay, let's get to max and let's see how our render changes when we change this F-number. Again, in photography, of course, we will use the standards that you saw on those images. In this case, I will use random numbers and we will try to lower our F-number, and let's see what happens in our render. If I'll go from 8 to 4, for example, you can see that we are opening our aperture and we allow more light to come in through our lenses. In this case, it's logical if more light comes in, of course our render will be brighter. Let's get back to the default value of 8 and let's talk about the last feature, the ISO. First of all, the ISO is about the camera film that we are using. Although in Vray this does not matter, in real world this matters a lot. You can see, for example, that the film on this image uses the ISO of 200. So in other words, we can say that the ISO is about the camera film sensitivity to the light. We can see even on this second example, the higher the ISO, the brighter the image is. And if we will get back to 3ds Max to our interior scene, you saw that in order to adjust the exposure for this image, I've used the ISO of 800. So the first question would be, why did I use the ISO and I didn't use the lower two features? First of all, we have to keep in mind that in real photography, the higher the ISO is, the more grain we are getting inside our image. In Vray, we control this level of noise or this grain using the settings of our render. That's why it's a lot easier to change the ISO first, as in Vray we can control that level of noise or that level of grain. You can see that when we decrease our ISO, we are getting a darker image, and vice versa. To adjust the exposure for this image, I've raised the ISO until I saw a good exposure for this interior scene. Let's talk a bit about the second method that we can use about the exposure value. First of all, you can see here the white balance. Some do use the white balance to adjust the output of the image. Some prefer to use neutral for white balance, but we can also control this parameter using the settings from the Vray frame buffer. So getting back to our exposure, you can see first of all that the ISO, when we enable the second method, it's great. Although it's not turned off completely, it's being adjusted using this value number. So in other words, we can say that we control the brightness of our image or the exposure using only one number. If I'll switch back to our first method, you can see that the ISO remained changed. So basically that's it for the camera third panel and these camera main features. And these are actually the two methods that you can use to adjust the exposure for your interior renders.